Ship crewman, what was the creepiest experience you had out on the ocean? Story 1. One of 3 guys sailing a 45-foot Morgan from Antigua to Daytona Beach, Florida. I had 0 crossing experience prior to this trip. Anyhow, I pictured getting tan, pina coladas, and white sand beaches. Nope. It was open ocean, at least by landlubber standards, and 3-hour shifts round the clock manning the helm, GPS, and radar, while the other 2 guys chilled during the day or slept at night. It was hard as heck, and I've done a few things considered somewhat tough and out of the ordinary. The biggest worry while on autopilot are the bazillions of ships flying around throughout the Caribbean. Yes, you can see them from many miles away, especially at night and with the help of radar, but they sneak up on you. And a 600-foot freighter captained by a possibly hammered crewman in the wheelhouse at 2 a.m. wouldn't even feel a bump as it split us into kindling. So one night I'm on shift trying to stay awake with Snickers and coffee, and it's so black you couldn't discern the horizon line. Just stars, blackness, and the running lights of lots of far-off freighters going in all directions. I proceed to take my occasional 360-degree glance around, like I was told, to make sure there's also nothing coming up aft. And oh my effing god! There's this giant round yellow light stretching what seemed like across the entire sky directly behind me. Clearly this was a freighter directly behind our boat with some kind of a spotlight on the bow, trained on us, and about to gobble us up like Jonah. The rush of terror was so great, I couldn't even stomp on the deck to awaken my mates, let alone scream for help. So I just accepted my impending death and wondered if it would be the impact or drowning that killed me first. Then I focused a little harder and realized it wasn't a ship at all. It was a full moon rising. I can't describe the immediate relief. It was like awakening from the most terrifying dream you've ever had and realizing, holy smokes, I'm not running from Freddy Krueger, I'm in my bed. Sailing a crossing like that, I learned, is hours and hours, and sometimes days and days of endless boredom, punctuated with short periods of DEFCON 10. DEFCON 1 is the highest alert level. With the greater the number, the lower the guard. Story 2. A friend, a captain, asked me to help deliver a sailboat from Fort Lauderdale to Houston. I was a somewhat inexperienced sailor, only sailing for fun a few times, short trips, but he was able to get me $100 a day, so I said, why not? I was unemployed. It was 3 of us, me, my captain, who is a very experienced sailor, and the new owner of the ship. Once we got to Anna Maria Island on the west coast of Florida, we prepared for the longest haul of our trip. The first time we'll be away from the coast, going through the Gulf of Mexico. We did a 4-hour shift, then you'd get to sleep, or do whatever, for 8 hours, until your next 4 hours. The eerie part for me was my shift, alone, pitch black darkness in the middle of the ocean, no moon out. You also have to avoid a lot of small oil rigs, some still active, some not active, some marked with lights, some not. You'd hear explainable sounds, etc. I don't know if it was just my head freaking with me, but that one overnight shift was pretty tense and scary for me. Towards the end of my shift, we hit some pretty bad rain and rough seas. My captain took over. I went to bed. I woke up a bit later to the crazy rough seas. I go back on deck, and my captain and the owner of the ship just yell, "We have to turn back. We lost our GPS." Apparently, the wind knocked it off the top of the mast and into the ocean. So there we are now, rough seas, pitch black, and with no GPS. Luckily, my captain is old school and knows how to sail with just a chart, so we made it back to Anna Maria and purchased a new GPS. The whole event was just surreal, and I was definitely worried a few times. The rest of the trip was uneventful. The next nights had nice bright moons, calm seas, and that made it a little less eerie. This is why you should always have an emergency backup sextant. Story 3. Number 1. First day on my first ship ever. It's winter and like 30 degrees, and the steel bulkheads/racks, beds, etc. are cold. Shipmate is nice enough to give me a small electric alarm clock to use the next morning. I climb in my rack and put the alarm over my head, kinda under the pillow, and crash. 2 a.m. I wake up after feeling something weird. Something just ran across my boot camp shaved head. I open my eyes and stare into the darkness. Then something else runs across my head. I turn on my overhead light in my rack, and about 24 roaches run for their lives. They were nesting on my alarm clock and my head to keep warm. Yes, this was a new guy joke. Yes, I used it later on someone else. No, it was almost 30 years ago, and I haven't forgotten. I still feel them sometimes. Number 2, same ship, out at sea, took a shortcut through the civilians' berthing bedrooms area. About 15 of them were sitting around a TV watching Animal Corn. Some were laughing, but others were too focused. Those others. Number 3, another ship out at sea. When emergencies happen, it doesn't matter who you are. Sometimes you have to get dirty. A line ruptured and flooded several spaces with pitch black oil, about neck high. On top of that, we were sure there were a few bodies in there. Me and a buddy had to climb into the oil pool and wade through 2 rooms to get the pumps placed and confirm other things. Power was cut off, of course, so we had nothing but flashlights. Yes, we found one of the bodies. The other guy was actually elsewhere napping on the job. Probably saved his own life. There's plenty more, but those are the first 3. Story 4. I worked on a cruise ship going from UK to Spain and back. Cross-channel ferry, really, but quite big at 37,000 tons, 2,500 passengers. We had a turnaround of about 4 hours in Bilbao, and at this time, I worked in the restaurant, and after we had cleaned up, they started hailing a passenger over the loudspeakers to disembark. I remember he had a slightly comical name like Passenger Peckham or Passenger Pickles or something. Then the managers came and told us to start searching our stations for him. Every bit of the ship was getting searched, and they kept hailing him and us searching right up until the outbound passengers started embarking. They even had us searching in little cupboards and in the fridges, etc. Obviously, Passenger Pickles had jumped off in the night into the cold Atlantic. So another time we were heading off at night during the winter gales, and about 5 hours offshore around midnight, I finished my shift and headed off to a crafty little platform at the stern where I could take my nightly reefer in peace, and I saw the massive bright ship's spotlights scanning slowly and methodically back and forth across the waves. I guessed this was for a jumper, and sitting there slightly baked, I could imagine perhaps glimpsing a last sight of some poor doomed soul struggling in the chop and wake before disappearing off into the vast black expanse of the Atlantic. An officer later confirmed the spotlights that night were for someone who had apparently jumped off a ship that had passed in the opposite direction. Story 5. Woke up at 3 a.m. to a search and rescue alarm, former coastie. I book it to the boat, we launch, and end up cruising along for a few hours. Everything is pitch black. One of the crew members is looking over the side at the bioluminescent algae being kicked up by our wake and says he saw something big roll over in our wake. We explain that it was probably a shark, and about 15 minutes later, a deep fog sets in. The fog is reflecting our running lights, so it looks like we're in a hallway or a tunnel. Everyone gets a little more tense. We start keeping a close eye on the GPS, and then the fathometer alarm goes off. We are in 5 feet of ocean. The alarm stops. We are in 300 feet, and then 3, and then 250, and then 6 feet. Something was swimming very close to the bottom of our boat. It was such an eerie experience. We never figured out what it was. Perhaps whales? Or the Kraken? We got to the boat we were rescuing, and everything else was uneventful. There's something wonderful about being on the ocean in the middle of the night, but things can be very strange too. Story 6. U.S. Marine here. During a float on a boat to Operation Top Secret, Destination Unknown, one of our own were lost at sea. I guess they just jumped overboard at night or something. Kinda depressing. That's a crappy way to die. Anyways, their coffin rack was adjacent to mine, and we left the rack made, and for some reason, the sheets kept on getting messed up every day. It was a pain in the butt to keep making the sheets. We stripped the rack, and we figured that no one should be sleeping in there since there were plenty of other vacant racks in the berthing. But someone would keep making the rack and messing the sheets up in the morning. I know aircraft carriers are big, but could someone really fake their own death on one and get away with it? There's no way someone would be sleeping there because we'd noticed someone climbing up on the top bunk, and the duty would have been posted at the entrances to the berthing. It was just creepy seeing the rack being made neatly and then messed up in the morning. Story 7. Not a ship, but you know in the movies, the creaking sounds on a submarine from the pressure when going deep? The first time you hear them for real is a bit unnerving. I've not spent much time at sea compared to many who should post their stories, but you're right, the creaking, especially at night, is unnerving to start with. I've spent about 9 years out at sea, and there were a couple of things that stuck with me. The very worst was a colleague hanging himself overboard on purpose, going next to a tornado off the coast of Taiwan and the massive waves around us. Hearing a PA from the captain to pick up a heavy tool and head on to the back of the ship next to the handrail, and it was not a drill. Turned out a ship that went past us in the opposite direction changed direction and started following us. Nothing came out of it. The very last one I remember was hearing a splash and starting looking overboard to spot what fell in the water, only to realize it's dolphins playing. Story 8. My buddy and I were about 20 miles west of the Lower Keys in the Gulf of Mexico. We were on his Bertram looking for dolphins and wahoo when we saw a boat in the distance heading our direction. We weren't under power or anything, just drifting and drinking beer. The boat gets closer and we see smoke. It was pretty much a burned-out cabin at that point, but still running. It just idled by. We yank our lines up and go run it down. Luckily, no charred corpses, that I could see. I kicked it into neutral with a gaff, and we decided to see where it came from. On the way, we reported its location to the Coast Guard. We drove that general direction for probably 10 miles. Didn't see a single thing. No other boats, no life jackets, nothing. Hopefully the people who were on that boat were picked up safely. It was like something from The Walking Dead, just a burned-out boat floating on by. Story 9. Not creepy, but gross. I was chumming and cutting bait at 5 a.m. on Jeffrey's Ledge in New England. I kept hearing weird splashing sounds every few minutes, but it was still dark. I was a noob at the time. Around 5:30, I could see a little better, but not great. I think I kept seeing a buoy looking like a giant road cone popping up out of the water, then it would disappear again. I was full of what the F. Captain comes out on deck and catches me staring off into the sea. He looks out, the road cone pops up a few hundred yards off. He looks back at me and starts laughing his butt off. How long have you been watching that whale jerk off? Humpback whales jerk off by rolling around on the surface of the water using the splash as friction. Honestly, this is the best story here. Story 10. Deep fog. Like I couldn't see the front of the yacht, sailing, and it was only 50 feet. The real creepy part came from the radar system tracking the boats and ships around us. Our radar, not being a commercial shipping or fisherman spec, was not quite as accurate, so sometimes boats would disappear, be right on top of us, or appear in sight but not on radar. That, on top of the sheer quantity of marine debris throughout the ocean, made me really scared that some boats had sunk when they dropped off radar. Especially in the months after Fukushima, the situation was terrible in the Pacific. The number of boats adrift and lost was among, if not the highest it ever was in the history of mankind. Story 11. Cousin is a ship captain or something. One time they were loading cargo from Bandar Abbas Bay in Iran to transfer to Abu Dhabi in the UAE. A cat had climbed on board without anyone noticing. Halfway through the Persian Gulf, she began meowing like crazy, and they were all legit spooked. Some started saying ghosts, or thinking they were legit sailing in haunted waters. After 3 hours of shipmates searching like crazy, they finally found her hiding between cargo containers. They dropped her off in Abu Dhabi as an illegal immigrant. Garfield's plot against Nermal finally came to fruition. Story 12. The doldrums. You spend a year or two at sea watching the waves and winds blow constantly, and then one day, they stop. Not so much as a whisper of wind, and the sea is like glass. It feels as if time has stopped. Realizing how creepy it feels, the captain calls for an all-stop and goes dead in the water. Like a horror movie, everyone migrates topside and just stares to the horizon. No one says a word, and you can hear yourself breathe. He lets the ship rest there for an hour, and the sailors freak out. Panic can set in quickly with a green crew. The only thing the captain says when we get underway is, "Men, this is the doldrums." That mustard knew what he was doing. Story 13. This was over 30 years ago when we were living aboard a 22 a day, our first boat. We pulled into a dock and were trying to sleep. We heard the crackling sound, almost like twigs burning. It was very concerning. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with my boat. Our neighbor didn't help. He said it was fiberglass worms. Apparently, this is some mollusk that attaches itself to the hull and clicks in some way that the hull picks up and amplifies. That would be a sheephead, convict fish, eating barnacles off your hull. Freaked me out the first time I heard it, all those crunching noises. Story 14. Worked for a bit as a deckhand on fishing boats out of San Diego. A few times we would come across deserted smaller boats, pangas, drifting with outlandishly big motors. Every time the captain would just cut hard port or starboard to get away from them as quick as possible. I knew they were drug-running boats that had probably dropped off their cargo, but I would check them out with the binoculars if we were close. One had 2 people on it. Both had clearly been shot a bunch of times, and one was moving and fairly alive. I told the captain, got a disapproving head shake, and we were on our way. Story 15. Not my story, but my grad advisor. He is a sailor, and after getting into grad school, he took a year off to sail the world. He was in one of the last long legs, South Africa to Brazil. He accidentally turns off the autonav, thinking it was the stove. He was also the cook. Thinking, oh crap, he quickly turns it back on and fries it. The following is a good 3 weeks of not knowing whether the captain or the only other sailor will go nuts and kill him in his sleep for effing up. He bailed in Brazil and took a plane home. Story 16. Came upon an empty life raft in the middle of the Atlantic. In all likelihood, it was probably an accidental discharge. Maybe a crew member was effing around with the release or something. Who knows? The implications otherwise are very disturbing, though. Did a ship go down with all hands without anyone making it to the raft? Was the raft abandoned for some reason? It left me feeling vaguely disturbed for a while afterwards. Free raft! Story 17. My dad told me this story once. He spent a year fishing off the coast of Alaska. One night, he and another boat were racing to get the last slip. The other would have to moor in the harbor for the night. That night, there was a storm, and the fish in the bottom of the boat moored in the harbor all slid to one side and capsized the boat. My dad woke up the next morning to find the entire boat's crew had drowned in their sleep. I'm sure they were awake when it happened. Story 18. We had a naval chief petty officer die of a heart attack while underway on board our sub. Since we were doing spec ops off the USSR coastline, we could not surface and come off station for 60 days. So every time we had to go into the freezer to get food, there was the chief laying on the shelf with his eyes wide open and frozen. He was wrapped in cling wrap material so you could see his face clearly. So next time you open your freezer at night, just think of having to look at someone's face looking back at you. I can't believe the body wasn't at least put in a body bag. Story 19. I got to see glowing algae on top of the ocean in the middle of the night, having a smoke on the upper decks after my watch on a warship. Surreal and extremely uncommon, but a memory I'll have for the rest of my life. One of the most magical experiences at sea was seeing a school of flying fish skim over the bioluminescent sea. Can't even describe it. I hope I'll remember that for the rest of my life. Story 20. Found a sailboat adrift after a storm in the Atlantic with nobody aboard. We decided to tow it to Florida. A couple of us went aboard to attack the line. There was a foot of water and tons of bondage corn floating around in it. Never found out who the owner was. Reported it in Key West and left it in the harbor. Story 21. Was on a fishing trip off the coast of Oregon. This was about a year after the big tsunami in Japan. The captain saw something off in the distance, so we went to look. It was a small refrigerator with Japanese writing on it. Just creepy to know that it was probably washed out of someone's apartment. Story 22. We did a man overboard drill on the way to Hawaii, which includes throwing a dummy into the water. I went portside to see the experience in less than 1 minute, and by the time I reached the water, there was already an 8-foot shark waiting near the dummy. Story 23. I was on a ship during Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf of Mexico. During the worst of it, the wind made the eeriest noises, and the ship was creaking and making all sorts of metal-on-metal noises a ship shouldn't make. Story 24. Had a friend go out night diving in Wellington Harbor, turned around in the water and saw a monstrous great white swimming straight toward him. Turned his flash off for some reason. Story 25. Found a wrecked-up yacht off the coast of Bermuda with 1 dead man and 1 half-drunk and injured man. We thought no one was alive until the one guy screeched at us. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.